Well, thanks everybody for coming. Oh boy, what a beautiful day. This is a beautiful day, beautiful city. I'm glad you're here. I'd like to talk a little bit about my own journey and how I came to write a book like this, because it really represents a pretty radical shift in the way we think about this constellation of disorders that we're calling dementia. And so I need to kind of take you along because it's quite a bit different from what you may be taught in other courses from other professionals. Are we good? Okay. So I'm a physician by training, internist and geriatrician, and was in private practice for several years, but I've spent more than 20 of the last years of my career working full-time in long-term care settings in large nursing home communities in Rochester, New York. And like many people, I've cared for a lot of people living with dementia of various types, and like a lot of people, I also have been confronted with people who have different episodes of distress or other expressions of need. And like most other people, I've often responded in the past by using a variety of psychotropic medications to try to meet those needs. And over time, I'm really disenchanted with what I'm actually accomplishing with those. Early on, even before the literature started to grow, I was starting to question the approach of giving people antipsychotics and other drugs just because they were distressed, and trying to find other solutions. And for a while, I began lecturing about what you might call non-pharmacologic interventions. And what I found was that they often would seem to work for a while, but they would also wear off, and I was left back at the med book trying to figure out what to give people next. And it took me a while to really figure out exactly where we're going wrong here. And one of the things that Nader alluded to that was also important in the genesis of this thinking was my work with the nursing home culture change movement. And the culture change movement's a fancy and somewhat imprecise name for a movement of people who want to transform long-term care from institutionalized living into more enlivening, enabling places for people to live and work, and to just get away from a purely institutional medical model of care of the body to a place where people can continue to engage with life in all its varieties. And several of those movements have emerged over the past couple of decades, and of those, the largest one was founded by Dr. Bill Thomas, and it's called the Eden Alternative. Eden is in the Garden of Eden, and the idea being that putting people in a sterile, single-generation environment is not most conducive to well-being and growth. And it has a lot of adherence and a whole pathway of how organizations can transform their care towards more of a home-based model rather than a hospital-based model of care. So what I saw in looking at that was people who looked at the model of long-term care that we have had for 50 years and said, it doesn't have to be this way, it can be different, and we can still meet people's needs and create better lives. And so I thought, well, if I can use that same kind of paradigm shift, maybe I can look at dementia that way and say this can be different too. Maybe, you know, there are really two ways to look at the suffering and distress that goes on with dementia. One is to say, well, it's just a terrible thing to have it, and until we find a cure, people are going to suffer. Or you can say, well, maybe there's something wrong with our approach to care, and if we could actually find better ways to engage people and create well-being, then we could create a new life for people living with cognitive disorders. And so that was the pathway I took. And what I discovered when I started to challenge myself in my own medical training was that we have a fairly rigid and narrow view of looking at this constellation of disorders. It's what I call the biomedical model of dementia. And you know, dementia's had kind of a checkered history ever since Eloise Alzheimer described a 59-year-old woman back before the turn of the last century. And Alzheimer's and dementia over the past century have been shaped not only by medical findings, but also by social and political and financial impacts as well. It's interesting how this whole concept has been viewed differently through society over the years. And the big proponents of the medicalized view now say that this is not normal aging, that this is a disease, a constellation of diseases, degenerative diseases of the brain. And that this is really focused, this whole medical view is focused on deficits and loss. We see people for what they can't do. We stage people according to what they've lost. We tend to do a lot of narrow standardized tests to evaluate people. So we'll say, can you spell world backwards, or 100 5 times in a row, or can you tell me what day it is, or who the president is? And as such, we take these very narrow cognitive skills, and then we make wholesale determinations about people's capabilities based on those. And those skills describe care, living environments, activities that are offered to people, are all driven by these deficit-based models of evaluating people. We tend to see the burden of the illness, the costs of the illness for the individual, for families, for society, for our medical care system. And as such, we tend to put most of our research dollars into medical drug research to try to find new medications to try to forestall or cure this condition. So this is sort of the biomedical view of dementia. And I want to start by saying that there's nothing inherently wrong with that view. All those things that I described to you do happen. It is a progressive illness. It does tend to get worse over time for many people, for most people. It does involve a lot of burden. It does involve a lot of distress. It does cost a lot of money to care for people who have cognitive disability. So my criticism of that is not that it's so much that it's wrong, is that it's a very narrow view that doesn't capture the whole person. I think as our research has gotten more sophisticated and we've been able to use electron microscopes and chemical probes, what we find is the more we're looking at plaques and tangles and tau proteins, the less we're actually seeing the person that surrounds those brain cells. And I think that's important because it creates, number one, some blind spots, and number two, there's a lot of fallout from a narrow biomedical view of dementia. And here's some of the fallout. Some of the fallout is that we tend to see distress as a manifestation of diseased nerve cells and chemical imbalances. So our response when people are distressed is to say, well, it's because they have a damaged brain, and that leads us down the road of prescribing medications for people, sometimes potentially harmful medications, because if it's a medical illness, that's how you treat medical illness. It tends to create research practices that ignore the experience of people who live with dementia. And I think that's a mistake. But you know, in the biomedical mindset, we want an evidence base, and these people are confused. We can't trust what they say, so that doesn't go into our research methodology at all. We tend to create a lot of disempowerment. We tend to judge people as being incapable and disempower them even more quickly than maybe their abilities would dictate. And as a result, we create stigma and we create excess disability. And even our charitable organizations, in trying to raise awareness and raise money for the illness, stigmatize and dehumanize people, using phrases like the long goodbye or the living death or people fading away, are actually dehumanizing, diminishing statements about the people that we're trying to be supporting. And we tend to create institutional disease-based approaches to care. And so this is some of the fallout that happens when you have this narrow view. These are the things that create excess disability beyond what the brain changes themselves would cause for the person. How bad is the stigma? Well, you know, you got a gentleman who lives right here in town who spends a lot of time here at AgeSong named Ed Boris. And you may have met Ed or talked about him with Nader. Ed was one of those people that opened my eyes a little bit to what it's really like to live with one of these disorders. Ed was diagnosed, if you don't know, with Alzheimer's several years ago. And at that time was retired, working with people with disabilities, but also having spent a career in the affordable housing industry, dual degrees in business and divinity, a very talented guy. And when Ed began to develop symptoms, they were really things that he recognized. They weren't things that were obvious to his friends around him. He would have difficulty finding words, or he might know the rhythm of what he wanted to say, but the actual words to fit the rhythm would not come out. Or he would do things that I'm sure never happened to anybody here. He'd maybe lose his car in the mall parking lot or something like that. You know, we all do that, but what Ed found was that his mental map of going back and procedurally figuring out where the car was and how he left it was not working the way he thought it should. So he had a bunch of subtle symptoms that mostly he was noticing. He went to the doctor himself, and he said to his doctor, I'm having trouble doing this and this and this. I want to be tested for Alzheimer's. So the doctor did the cognitive tests, the x-rays, the blood tests, and it turned out that Ed did have what we call Alzheimer's. Unfortunately, the way Ed found out was 3 weeks later he got a letter from his doctor with the word dementia on top and 3 pages of information. So that's, you know, 2 problems for Ed. Number 1, a distressing diagnosis. Number 2, having to find a new doctor, I guess. But one of the first things Ed did was he went to one of the local support organizations and drove himself there, walked in the door, and said, "My name is Ed Voris. I've just been diagnosed with early stage dementia, and I'm here to get some resources of support." And the person at the desk said to him, "Well, where's your family member? Where's your advocate?" And he said, "Well, I'm here to advocate for myself." And they said, "Well, we can't talk to you. Come back when you have a family member." So that's how quickly it can happen, the stigma and the disempowerment. This is a gentleman who, before he said the word, had no appearance of having any kind of illness. And he went to a couple different, adult agency type organizations around town and got the same response every time he went somewhere. So not only is this happening, but it's happening from the people who are most charged to understand this condition. And if these people create stigma, then imagine what the average Joe the plumber thinks about dementia, about Alzheimer's. I got a little clue. One of the people who I've become good friends with, Dr. Richard Taylor, who I'll quote today during my talk, has lived with Alzheimer's now for over a dozen years, and we speak a lot together. I've made a couple of videos, and Richard and I were speaking in Atlanta, and we went to a famous Southern cooking restaurant down in Atlanta one night. And Richard, as usual, was wearing a suit. He's dressed to the nines, as always, perfectly groomed and perfectly articulate. And the hostess, who was a very charming lady, sat us down and was making small talk. She could tell we were not from in town. And she asked us what we were doing there. Richard explained that we were there to talk about Alzheimer's and that he himself had been living with Alzheimer's for several years. And she was absolutely flabbergasted. She could not imagine how a person with Alzheimer's could speak coherently, how he could walk into a restaurant and order food and eat in public. Her view of Alzheimer's was such that you are pretty much in a vegetative state. And so this is the stigma that we have created around this illness. And with the stigma comes fear. And with the fear comes the idea that we create something, worse than it really is, and create such fear that we then create more stigma and more disempowerment of people. We start to see people in very inhuman terms. There was a study that looked at descriptions of people with Alzheimer's by the public and looked at descriptions of zombies from movies and found that the language was almost indistinguishable between the two. So this view of a person as not being there. And that's damaging when it comes to care environments, because think about this. If you see that there's no longer a person there, what is your ethical obligation to provide them respectful, dignified care? It goes away because there's no longer a person. And so this is an important thing when it comes to how we support people. Our attitudes shape the way we approach people. One of the gentlemen whose books I recently researched in writing my latest book, Thomas DiBaggio, was a former nursery owner, nursery as in plant nursery, for many years, who lived with Alzheimer's and eventually passed away. But he wrote a couple of very insightful books about his experience. And the first one is fairly grief-laden because he's going through the typical grief that is not only experienced by people with a diagnosis, but also compounded by the stigmas of society. And but he also has those moments of insight and growth that go throughout his narratives too. And I was just inserting one of his quotes. He had a fish pond, and he would go out and feed the fish with fish pellets, but he noticed that rats were stealing some of the food pellets. And he mentions that it's easy for us to form attachments to animals like dogs and cats and even fish. But rats have this weight of history of disease and hatred and fear that makes it very hard to cuddle with a rat. And he made the connection. He said, Alzheimer's is like that too. Through our fear, we've created something that people have to shun and have to hate. And it creates this hatred that actually makes life worse for us than it would be otherwise. And he concluded the little story by saying that every day he would go out and throw a few pellets to the rats too. He decided that they needed some support too because of the stigma that had been built up around them. So just interesting insights. And this kind of leads into one of those criticisms of the biomedical model is I've learned so much from people who live with these disabilities that I would not have learned from medical texts. And so we do need to listen to what people say. Even if they seem to be confused, even if they seem to us to be in a different reality, they have much to teach us about that reality and about how we can not only better support them, but how we can better grow as human beings and provide better systems of care. So I realized, after doing all this, that I had a lot of stigma and a lot of prejudice that was inbred in me through my medical training, through my societal training about dementia. And that if I was going to break into a new paradigm, I needed to break this down into a view that was as neutral and non-judgmental as I could possibly get. And that wasn't easy to do, but I kept working at it. How can I describe the process of cognitive loss in a way that doesn't judge or stigmatize people? But still it gives a depiction of what's happening. So I came up with a very simple, very fuzzy, kind of flaky definition. And that definition I came up with, which is the centerpiece of my first book, is dementia is a shift in the way a person experiences the world around her or him. And that's all I wrote, just a shift in the way we experience the world, the way we process information and maybe respond to it as well. And I like that because this actually happened to everybody in this room. I'm not saying that you live with dementia or that you're going to live with dementia, but as we live and grow, our experience of the world changes. And for those in the room who are maybe 50 or older, we don't experience the world the way we did when we were 20 or 25. And if you're in the latter category, you probably don't experience the world quite the way you did when you were 8 or 10. I think that's fair. And that will continue to go on through life. Your self evolves. And it evolves a little bit more quickly, more drastically when you live with Alzheimer's or other forms of cognitive loss. But the truth is that it gives us a way to connect ourselves to the experience of the person, to understand that we all have changing perspectives. And if we can connect ourselves rather than putting people in the box and, here, let me grab you a chair here, do what we call othering people, putting them as sort of the demented other that we don't understand, we actually can find better ways to connect with and to support those people. So it's a definition I like because number one, it's not as stigmatized, and number two, it helps unite us in finding better ways to live, better ways to care. When I started with that definition, now granted, you know, if I were a researcher trying to find the latest drug, that definition wouldn't help me. It doesn't tell me anything about the biochemistry or the neurology of Alzheimer's. It's a very fuzzy definition, but for a person who's trying to provide support, it's actually a perfect definition because it takes all that stigma away and lets us get inside a shifting experience and then start to build on that. And so the more I played with that, the more I found it took me down a very different road than the one I've been traveling. It took me down a road to not seeing fatal disease, but actually seeing different abilities or changing abilities or disability, however you want to say that. And I got that from my friend Richard Taylor, who I first met in Singapore at Alzheimer's Disease International. And he got up and gave a keynote and he said, "I'm not dying of a fatal disease. I'm living with a chronic disability." Well, that was a big paradigm shift for me because first of all, he went from dying to living. And he went from fatal disease to chronic disability. And you know, our goals for people with developmental disabilities are different really than they are for people with Alzheimer's. Our goals with Alzheimer's are still around either trying to forestall death or delay decline or at the far end of the spectrum cure their condition. With people with developmental disabilities, we're not looking for hard to reach cures. And we're not just trying to keep people alive longer. We are helping people to live, to grow, to be educated, to have meaningful work or volunteer opportunities in their community, to continue to engage in the larger community. And so when you think about disability, it actually opens your mind to a much larger playing field about what is possible for people who live after these diagnoses. Richard Taylor says that, you know, the long goodbye to him means that, you know, after the doctor makes a diagnosis, it's like he pulls out a starting pistol and shoots it off and says, "Okay, the long goodbye has started." And he feels that people don't come by to see you anymore because who wants to come by and say goodbye every day, maybe for year after year. When he first dealt with the grief of his own diagnosis at age 58 about, he found that his friends stopped coming around to see him. That discomfort and stigma and fear actually isolated him more. And he finally called up one of his friends and he said, "How come you don't come by to see me anymore?" And his friend said, "Richard, I just didn't know what to say." And Richard's response was, "How about hello?" You know, great place to start when you don't know what else to say. There's a human being still there, so let's make connections and see what happens. So other things that this new definition did for me, it helped me to see that we need to use this disability metaphor to create what I call ramps for people living with dementia. And the metaphor I often use to teach this shift is that if someone were paralyzed from the waist down and living with a wheelchair, we would not expect them to climb a flight of stairs. We'd provide a ramp or some disability access so they can continue to succeed in our world where we all walk. The problem with dementia is we're not building ramps for people. And in this case, I'm talking about cognitive ramps more than physical ramps. We put them in care environments that are based around our view of the world and our operational needs, and we expect them to fit in that box. We're putting square pegs into round holes. And when they don't fit, we blame their disease and we give them antipsychotics or other pills to try to normalize these, quote, behavior problems. Imagine a guy with a wheelchair sitting in front of a flight of stairs wondering what to do because there's no ramp. Imagine us coming up to him and saying, well, we walk up the steps, so why don't you do that too? And we lift him up, and what's going to happen? You know, right in his face on the steps, because his legs don't work that way anymore. And if he's lying there cursing at us for dropping him on the ground, it'd be pretty funny to say to the other person, well, he's got a bit of a behavior problem. Let's give him a little Seroquel and see if we can calm him down. You know, it seems funny, but we do that every day in all living environments with dementia. We put them in places where they can't succeed. And then when the very predictable result comes along, we medicate them with powerful and potentially harmful drugs. And our research is showing now that these drugs really have very, very low efficacy and very high risk, particularly for older people, particularly people living with dementia. And when you think about, you know, the first thing I did in researching my book was I pulled all the literature on antipsychotics, because I've been prescribing these drugs. We all just, you know, quickly skim the medical articles and say, okay, here's the latest study, and we go off and do what we're supposed to do. I never read them critically or carefully or with this kind of holistic eye that I'm now using. When I read them that way, and I pulled every study I could find from the last 50 years, what I found was every single study that showed the benefit to these pills was sponsored directly by the company making the pill, first thing, okay? Now that doesn't invalidate the study. I know some of the researchers, they're good people, but it opens you to lots of bias in whom you select, in whom you exclude, in what your primary and secondary endpoints are, in how you analyze and report the data, and even what gets submitted for publication. You know, if one of the pharmaceutical companies is sponsoring a trial of their antipsychotic and a study is done that shows it doesn't do very much, you think they're going to send that to the New England Journal and get it written up? Of course not. So the best of the best are the only things that we ever see in print. And even those best of the best have a lot of flaws. When you start reading them critically, you realize that there's so many flaws in these studies that most of us were just too busy to pay attention to. But the amazing thing is that even if you take the best studies and ignore the flaws and take them at face value, you're only seeing a benefit above placebo that's maybe 15–18%. That's at best. And when you look at the flaws and biases, you see that even that number is probably inflated. The two studies I found that were not sponsored by pharmaceutical companies showed little or no benefit. In nursing homes, in community dwelling elders, in people with what appear to be hallucinations or delusions, in people that appear to be physically reactive, little or no benefit in any of those people. Then at the other side, we now, since my book came out and more studies have been done about this, have found that these drugs actually cause an independent risk of death, along with a lot of other medical complications. But that risk of death has been confirmed in at least 18 studies I'm aware of, and the average relative risk is about 70% higher than a sugar pill. So this is a pill that works very little and raises the death rate. So why do we use it? Are we bad people, stupid, uncaring? Of course not. We do it because people have very real distress. They're distressed. Their families are distressed. Their professional care partners are distressed. They call us asking us to help. And what do doctors do when you call them? They prescribe medication. We want to make the distress go away too. So we're in this paradigm of using pills, and we don't know any better way of caring for people. So that was really my charge with my book, was to come up with a different way, a different approach that could enable us to reduce or eliminate the use of these drugs and find other solutions to people's distress. So that's kind of where I took this. And really, when I looked at all this, all these things that changed, it led me to challenge our interpretations of distress. It led me to challenge the use of medications. It led me to challenge the living environments we construct for people with dementia. It really changed everything. Once I made this simple, fuzzy definition, it took me down a whole different road, and I'm still going farther into the rabbit hole instead of moving back toward the biomedical approach. The other thing, since I know a lot of you are psychology students, is that, you know, really the emperor's never had any clothes when you think about it. And this is something, another sort of group delusion we've all had. You know, if you look back at the classical theory of where does schizophrenia come from biochemically, you can talk about the genetics and everything, but what's going on inside the brain, we believe, is that somehow the action of dopamine has been upregulated. So there's more dopamine activity than there should be. And we know that too much dopamine can cause delusions and hallucinations. In that case, giving a drug that blocks dopamine activity makes sense, right? That's what antipsychotics do. They lower that dopamine level in the brain to try to bring you back to more of an even keel. But I've done some research on the biochemistry of dementia, all types of dementia, and guess what? Dopamine levels in various forms of dementia are either depressed or at most normal. They're never elevated. So where's the rationale to giving drugs that block dopamine activity when you don't have elevated dopamine activity to start with? In other words, what we're calling delusions and hallucinations are not so much the type of hallucinations you see with schizophrenia or with drug delirium as they are a person interpreting the world through different pathways because some of the pathways have been broken and reporting a different view of the world than we see. And because it sounds confused to us, we label it a delusion and we give these antipsychotic drugs. It's not psychosis. The people that truly are delirious or psychotic usually have a drug reaction. They're usually being given Sinemet for their stiffness, and that's what's making them hallucinate. It's not so much the brain illness itself. Even the case of Lewy body dementia, which is classically described as having vivid visual hallucinations, what it is the visual cortex is affected in the brain. It's degenerating, and it's sending off showers of lights and things you see. Sometimes organized, sometimes not. But that's not dopamine. That's not something that's going to respond to taking dopamine away. So once again, our use of psychiatry to describe neurologic changes has led us down a road of positioning people as being different than they are and using these drugs that really, even when you look at it through medical eyes, doesn't make sense. And then when you get through the larger experiential eyes that I'm talking about, you can really see that there are needs that this person has to navigate and succeed in their environment that we're not meeting. And that's really where the secret lies, is understanding what those needs are. So before I go on, I've been talking for a few minutes now. It's about 12:30. Let me just pause right there and see how this is settling with all of you, see what questions you have. And then I'll talk about some of my newer work with where I'm trying to go with this and where this whole culture change part fits into. So who's got a question? Don't be shy. Yes?
It sounds to me that you're against medication. I can understand if you're creating some very important you made some very important statements. I'm wondering what you think about like dementia and some of the other medications.
Yeah, that's a good question. When I wrote the book and called it Dementia Beyond, the question was, what do I think about the so-called symptomatic cognitive enhancers, the Namenda, Aricept, Razodine, Exelon, those types of drugs. When I wrote Dementia Beyond Drugs, I was focusing on antipsychotics and drugs that are used for behavioral distress. So people often ask me, well, okay, well, what about this class? I'll give you my opinion, and once again, you talk to 10 different doctors, you're going to get 10 different opinions. The golfer Seve Ballesteros said, I don't trust doctors, they're just like golfers, everyone has a different answer to your problem. So I'm going to give you my opinion based on my years of using these drugs, and I have used them many times. What these drugs do, and I think even the researchers will tell you this, matter of fact, Pierre Theriault, one of the main researchers, did a lot of his early studies on this and on drugs like Depakote at St. John's Home, where I worked, and with some of the people I cared for. So I was in on some of these studies. And what he'll tell you is that they don't work for everybody. When they do work well, which may be a third of the cases, what they might do is they don't stop or even slow the rate of change over your lifetime. They don't reverse it, certainly. What they do is they may set the clock back 6 to 9 months by kind of whipping the nerves to produce more acetylcholine and keep it in the brain spaces longer. And so if I am living with Alzheimer's and I take Aricept and it helps me, or Namenda, whatever, what it means is that my cognitive abilities will be somewhat similar to what they might have been back in January or February. But it doesn't stop there. I will continue to have a progression of my capabilities that is similar to what I had before. But if that's 9 months when you can live independently, when you can not be in a nursing home, for those people it may be beneficial. But it doesn't stop or reverse the course of illness. And so when people ask me about this, I always tell them that if they want to try it, I actually support that. But the caveat is you have to be realistic about what it can and can't do. It doesn't work for everybody. Even when it does, you know, the studies that were used to approve these drugs, they use a 70-point scale, the ADAS-COG scale, you know, 70 points of abilities. And what they found was in the early studies, on the average, a drug like Aricept would improve your performance by 4 points out of 7, or 4.5 points. Now, statistically, that was significant. And because there was nothing else on the market but that horrible drug Cognex that nobody used, the FDA was quick to approve it. But what do those 4 points mean for most people as far as your life, your capabilities, your ability to live independently, to do very integrative tasks? It's more of a statistical number than a reality for a lot of people. A lot of people feel they can focus better, and if they can, more power to them, and I'm willing to use it. But once again, I just want to make sure that the people who ask about it and their families are realistic about what it will and won't do. A person who has to live in a nursing home because of advanced disability, I've never seen them get up and go home because I gave them Aricept or Namenda. So we just want to be realistic about possibilities.
What are the risks You get this little change. What are the...
There are side effects, and you have to let people know that there can be side effects too. The biggest ones are the gastrointestinal side effects. You can get cramps, diarrhea, stomach upset, decreased appetite. Because what they do is they stimulate acetylcholine. Well, acetylcholine is not only in the brain, it's throughout the body. One of the places acetylcholine is in the gut. It's a digestive stimulant. So when you take Aricept, it may make your gut start working overtime, and you may get cramps, diarrhea, stomach upset that can ruin your appetite. A lot of people, probably most people who've stopped the pill have stopped it because of stomach upset. It's funny, Peter Whitehouse, a neurologist who wrote a book challenging to the status quo called The Myth of Alzheimer's several years ago, decided that he would take some himself just to see if it enhanced his ability to focus and think. Not living with Alzheimer's, just decided, I'm going to take some Aricept. So he got his doctor to monitor him to make sure he was safe and everything, check his blood pressure and everything. And he unfortunately never got to find out. He had to stop it after a few days because it made his stomach so upset that he couldn't take it. And he wondered how many people who can't talk to us are we giving, upsetting their stomachs. They're getting distressed. We're calling it behavior problems. And then we pile the antipsychotic on top of the Aricept because we didn't understand that they were expressing side effects. So that's a big side effect. Now, where else is acetylcholine? Well, it's in the bladder. So some people have worsening incontinence of the urine because it's making the bladder contract. The other place is it slows down the heart when the heart's too fast. So some people actually get too slow a heartbeat from it. And some people have actually looked like they need a pacemaker when actually it was just the side effect of the drug which needed to be stopped. But it can also affect the brain in negative as well as positive ways. I've actually stopped Aricept in people or Namenda because it caused more confusion. Go figure, I don't know why, but whenever you're messing with brain chemicals, it's a little inexact. You got all these brain centers and you're just throwing this shotgun effect at them, and some people it helps, some people it doesn't. So you just have to go in with open eyes. The other thing is there's this voodoo that a lot of neurologists have, and once you start it, you can't stop it because people are going to go downhill faster, you know? And there is, when people have been out for a long time, there's a little bit of a withdrawal phenomenon if you yank it away. But what I've found is there is a time in many people's lives when it's pretty clear that the pill's not helping. And if you taper it slowly, cut it in half for a month, then cut it in half again or take it away, I've never seen such worsening of abilities that I felt that they had to be put back on. Or if I did see what it appeared to be doing more than I thought, you can start right back at the previous dose and they do okay with that. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you think there's a relationship between, I'd imagine there's a great deal of caregiver and kind of family member discomfort around being with the person with dementia and kind of having to go through that. And I'm wondering if you think there's a relationship between that and this kind of drug prescribing culture and kind of
yeah. I mean, we have to put the stigma of dementia on our larger societal views, not only of dementia, but of health and illness and how we fix things in our society. And all you have to do is turn on daytime TV for an hour and watch all the drug ads that come your way. Yeah. Got a problem, take a pill. Got another problem, take a pill. Those pills cause problems, take a third pill to get rid of those problems, you know. And so that is kind of our mindset is we fear dementia and so we want to fix it. And I was just reading this wonderful book about communities by John McKnight and Peter Block. And they said that the consumerist society that we have created says to communities, and this applies to healthcare as well as other aspects of community life, we are here as a system to fix your problems. You know, you're broken, you're inadequate, we will fix it, you go back to sleep, we'll take care of everything. And that's kind of the approach of this, you know, it's being maybe a little harsh, but that is sort of the approach that a lot of people fall into is, oh, this is a terrible thing, but we'll come up with a pill to make it go away. We don't have to deal with the hardships of living through life and dealing with loss and change if we can just medicate it away. And the truth is families have a tough burden because there's a real dynamic going on. You know, the person who may have raised you or who may be your lifelong spouse or life partner, all of a sudden is changing in ways that you can't always support or comprehend. And there's grief there. There's real grief. And we have to help people deal with that grief but also provide that kind of support. And different people have different, as you know, in psychology, different capacities to deal with hardship, to deal with grief, to deal with dependency that wasn't there before. And so you are being a psychotherapist with family members at the same time you're trying to help that person who lives with forgetfulness. So absolutely, there's all those stigmas and all those societal and psychodynamic relationships that come with family structures too. Yeah. So what can we do about this? Well, I'm going to, in my book, I'll give you an outline of my book, but then I'm going to jump to some of my newer thinking that I've expanded on from the first book, because I think that's even more exciting. What I think we need to do is, number one, we need to see dementia differently. We need to see the people that live with forgetfulness differently, and then we need to create systems of care that can support a different view. And that's where this whole culture change movement comes in. Not only in nursing homes, but you can really apply it to assisted living. You can apply it to home and community-based living. So we start by doing some of the paradigm shifting I'm talking about, seeing this illness differently. But then if you bring that to a very institutional place, like a traditional nursing home, and say, oh, you know, we're going to see people with dementia differently. We're going to cultivate meaningful relationships. We're going to find the needs behind the behavior. But you bring it into a system that rigidly keeps reinforcing the old way of thinking, you're not going anywhere. You have to actually shift operations in order to embrace new philosophies, because institutions kill new ideas. They like sameness, they like no surprises, they like the same, you know, it's homeostasis in an organization instead of a body. When the fever comes, your body works to lower the temperature. So when a new idea comes to an institution, the body works to bring that new idea back in line with the old way of thinking. So you have to shift operations. That's the key, and that's what culture change is, shifting operations to match a new philosophy. And that's a very slow, multifactorial, organic process that infuses an organization. So once again, as you can get, what I'm talking about is not a quick fix for somebody's distress or somebody's forgetfulness. It is changing systems to come up with a whole new way of viewing and supporting people, and that takes time. Some people's needs you can identify and meet immediately. Other people, it takes quite a bit of time to work and to create a new system to create those durable solutions. But simply taking away the antipsychotics because we know they're bad and not caring differently is not a path to success. We have to start down this path, even if it's going to take us a while, because we'll never have sustained reduction of medication if we don't create new ways of supporting. So in my book, my book is broken into thirds. The first third talks about what's wrong with our current approach to care. Not only the biomedical model and the pill paradigm, but also what's wrong with the institutional approach to long-term care and to assisted living. And then I give some basics of culture change, how we have to transform that. And the second part of the book uses that new definition to start looking at dementia differently and start talking about how we begin to transform organizations that provide care. And then the third part of the book is more of a symptom-oriented approach, that more practical, hands-on things for the care partner. Starting with how do you approach people and interact with them face-to-face? How do you communicate with them best, and how do you overcome communication barriers due to language problems, word-finding difficulties, whatever. And then going into some very specific scenarios. What if people are distressed? How can you interact with them? If people appear to be angry or strike out, how can you support them? And so, in a way, I mean, it's very helpful, and I do recommend the book, and I think it gives you insights, but in a way, it kind of devolves into that medical model thinking. How do you respond to this behavior or that behavior? And so that's really what I tried to accomplish with the new book is, okay, now I got to shift another paradigm. Why don't a lot of these non-pharmacologic interventions work? Well, it's because they often are responsive. They're not proactive. They react in a way to try to fix a deficit. It's still that deficit-based mentality of, you're broken, how can I fix this? And so what often happens is we might find that a lady becomes anxious or agitated at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and one of the care partners might discover that if you take her to a quiet place and hold her hand and talk softly to her, she calms down and stays calm the rest of the day. So that's our care plan. When she gets agitated, take her to a quiet place, hold her hand, speak softly to her, and she'll calm down. And that's what we do. But what happens the next day at 3 o'clock? It happens again, and we keep responding the same way because we're just reacting. We're not creating any kind of new approach to wellness for this woman so that the problem won't happen in the first place. And I liken it to treating pneumonia with cough syrup. Our problem is that we see these expressions of need as the problem rather than as a symptom of a larger need. And so we respond to the problem. And we can calm the problem for the moment, just like cough syrup may calm the cough for the moment. But the pneumonia is still festering, and if we don't get to the root of the problem, it's that eventually the person's going to get worse, the symptoms are going to return. So I believe that while I want to reduce medication, that's not the first goal, not the primary goal. It's a secondary outcome that's very desirable. And I even believe that reducing distress is not our primary outcome, because the distress we see is the cough, it's not the pneumonia. So what is the real goal? Well, I mentioned in my book a white paper that was written by a group of people involved with eating alternative about ultimate outcomes to create quality of life in people, getting beyond the traditional QOL scales that often are very based in medical model thinking or based in abilities. Because when you think about it, if we measure well-being by what you can or can't do, what you can or can't think, then people with disabilities can never be well because they're never going to meet those yardsticks. So what is something deeper that everybody can attain? Well, that's what they came up with, this definition of well-being. And there are a million different definitions, there are probably 7 billion different definitions of well-being in the world. But I decided to use theirs as my framework for further work. And I do mention it in the first book, and then the second book is entirely about those 7 domains of well-being. And I'm going to give you those 7 domains just because I think that they're helpful. I might even write them down because I have a board here, so I might as well use it, right? And this way you can remember them when I jump back to them. The first one is identity. Identity is having a personhood, a self, a story, a history. And granted, when you live with forgetfulness, you may forget some of that. But if your support structure can help know who you are and identify who you are, we can maintain your personhood and your identity throughout your life. Connectedness is all about relationships, knowing and belonging in the place you live and with the people around you. And I'm putting these in my own order because I find it easier to teach them this way than the order in which they were originally written up. The third one is security. Security is not just an alarm system on your nursing home, okay? Security is knowing and trusting the people that come up and lay hands on you. It's being treated with dignity and respect and modesty. It is having a balance between too much stimulation and too little stimulation. It's all those things. The next one, big one, and we're going to get to this in a moment to get back to Randy's question before the talk, autonomy. One of the biggest ones, and we got an earful about it last night from one of the residents here, about the need to be empowered and to be autonomous, even though you may live with a disability. Now we get to the fuzzier ones, but equally important, meaning doing things that actually speak to your values, your abilities, your interests. Growth, the idea that people in nursing homes and even people living with a condition like Alzheimer's can continue to grow and develop as human beings. And the last one, joy, I probably do not need to explain to you. That's pretty universal. So what I like about these is, number one, they're not tied into medical, functional, cognitive outcomes. You can be healthy and have these enhanced. You can have inoperable cancer and have all these things. You can have Alzheimer's and have all these things. So this gives us an ethical obligation to work on these things because we can't write somebody off because they have a condition and say they can't have these things. I personally believe that this is at the heart of most of the distress we see. And so when people ask me questions about things like anger, I go right to this chart. And this has become my new framework for understanding this. And I'll get to you in a moment, Randy, but just a couple of general comments. The reason I think that most people fear the idea of living in a nursing home is not because they don't think they'll get good care of the body. I think that most nursing homes, I know there's some hellholes you read about on, or watch on 60 Minutes, but I think the majority of care communities for our elders provide excellent medical and nursing care. I don't think people fear nursing homes because they don't think they'll have good doctors, good nurses, as much as they fear they're going to leave this stuff at the door when they move in. This is something we have not got a handle on providing and enhancing for people in our care scenarios, and family members caring for people living with these conditions at home. We're not very good at these either. We give the Arisop, we give the Namenda, we have that same sort of medicalized view of life. And so that's why I think most distress comes from the fact that these become eroded, partly because of the brain changes, but partly because the system of care and support around them erodes that further and creates excess disability. So to give you an example of how these take us deeper, let's talk about this issue of what we call wandering. And I'm putting wandering in quotes here because I'm going to get back to that in a moment, but it's a bit of a pejorative term. So often people come to me and they'll say, can you help us with Mrs. Smith? She has a problem wandering. Okay, now the first thing is we're seeing the behavior as the problem, not the symptom. We call it a problem of wandering, so we're going to respond to that problem. The second thing is I tell people, even wandering is a bit of a judgmental term. To me, wandering suggests, in my mind, somebody without a goal or a purpose. They're just kind of doing this aimless walking around. And so that automatically leads you to blame it on the brain. Diseased brain causes purposeless activity. So I start by asking people to give the person a goal. Go back and replace it with the word searching and follow them around and see what you find. Sometimes you can get insights by just changing that word and looking at the person with new eyes. But what I've found now in my travels is that even then, the majority of people, you may not have a specific thing that they're searching for, a physical thing. I find that even when somebody keeps coming up to you and saying, I want to go home, they're not necessarily talking about the home at 35 Ivy Street, you know, with the rose garden and the green shutters. What they're talking about is this stuff. They're living in an environment that doesn't provide the attributes of home, and they're looking for that. And so what do we do? Well, one thing we do is that we either tell them little white lies, well, you're going home tomorrow, or we give them the blunt truth, oh, your family sold your home 2 years ago, or we say to people, you live here now, this is your home, but what they're telling you is, this place I'm living in doesn't feel good to me. And so you can understand how when you say to them, you live here now, it's never going to make them feel better and solve their problem. They're looking, what you're providing me doesn't give me the attributes of home. So not to either lie or give the bold truth or try to convince people they have to stay here. The answer is to understand that we need to supply these things in that person's life because that's what they're expressing. And what we do, because we want to be restraint-free and we want to keep people safe, is we put alarms on the doors, bracelets on people to set off the alarms. We put a stop sign on the stairwell, or we paint a pretty picture on the elevator door so it doesn't look like an elevator. Or we create circular courtyards where people can wander but don't get out into traffic. We improve the clutter on the floor, improve the lighting, and we create a safe place, but the wandering doesn't stop, does it? Because all we've done is create a safe place for people to be lost in searching for these things. We haven't given them what they really need. So this doesn't make life easier, this model. This says we got to go deeper. If we really want to create better lives for people, we got to go to places we haven't gone to before. It's not enough to keep the body safe. We have to feed these domains of well-being. And then this book just expands into all the different ways you can recognize the things we do that erode well-being and how we can replenish that. So when someone says to me, like Randy did, you know, one of the things that he's often challenged by is issues of people who have a lot of anger. And I take this even further into people who have a lot of physical reactivity. What I used to call aggression in my first book, but my language is also evolving. Aggression sounds to me like someone who wants to hurt somebody, who's trying to hurt somebody, who has this need to be hurtful, okay? And I don't think that's fair when someone strikes out at you during a shower to just all of a sudden decide that they did that because they have this need to injure you. I think that they're responding to a situation that's out of their control. And I came up with a rule a long time ago for using the proper language. And language is the best way to start. The words we choose are so important in framing our attitudes and our behaviors. So I have a basic rule. When you describe what you're seeing with a person living with forgetfulness, don't use any word that you would not want used to describe you. So I decided if I don't want to be called aggressive by somebody when I'm angry, I shouldn't use it either. So I've gotten rid of it. So I'd say that people are physically reactive, and even reactivity has a bit of a negative connotation. It doesn't suggest a positive response. But in truth, that's what's happening. You are being put into a corner, and you react in a way that's not necessarily positive, but it's your response to being in the situation. So when I think about people who are either verbally or physically reactive, I look primarily at the domain of autonomy and secondarily at the domain of security. It may be all these things to some extent, but this is where these things reside. Most people who lash out in one way or another are doing so because they do not have a sense of choice or control about their situation. And they're expressing themselves in the best way they know how. So what I say is, okay, this person has a problem with autonomy. This person does not have the autonomy they feel they need. How can we start to create more autonomy for that person within the framework of what we're doing to help care for that person? Secondarily, there can be security too. So if you do something that makes somebody feel insecure, and particularly when you surprise them in that way, they might also lash out. So that's the secondary domain. If you're going to start, you know, put your money on one horse, that's where I tell people to start. Some of the biggest areas where people exercise this anger and autonomy are in the areas of taking a pill or having a shower or a bath. And sometimes it's something about the pill or the way the shower or bath is being done that is part of it. And I talk a lot about that in my book. And I think it's worth, when someone, you know, declines a shower angrily, It's worth looking at the process of the shower and asking what can we do to make this a better experience. But sometimes it's about this larger domain of autonomy. It's symbolically saying, I have no choice or control in daily life in this living environment. And there's two places where I can exert choice and control over you. One is I can shut my mouth and refuse to swallow a pill. And the other is if you got to take me 200 feet down the room to a shower room, I can dig in my heels and say I'm not going. So often little aspects of lost autonomy get expressed in these big areas. So sometimes when someone says no to a pill or a shower, it's not so much the shower, it's the I have no choice or control. And what I've often found is that when you work to restore little bits of choice and control throughout the day, often the big no's go away because you have met the deeper domain of autonomy for the person. You've given them the message that yes, you still have some choice and control in your life. Just because you live with Alzheimer's, just because you live in a nursing home or assisted living doesn't mean you've abdicated all control. And so that's really how I use these to find deeper meaning. Now in the case of personal care, there are other aspects that you have to directly deal with too. And I use an acronym for personal care when people are angry or resistive, which is the word C, S-E-E. The S stands for slow down, because often when people lash out, it's because we're doing things either that they don't want to do or too quickly for them to do it, or we don't give them time to comprehend and accept what we're doing before we do it. The second one is empower, give people choice and control throughout a task. So if someone is having a bath, make sure that they drive it. Okay, next time we should wash your face. Would you like to wash your own face or would you like me to help you? Is the water temperature okay? Is it too hot? Is it too cold? Make sure the person gives you guidance before you proceed. Now a lot of care partners get a little bit nervous and they say, well, what if I ask somebody permission and they say no? And my response is, well, you do well to find out why they're saying no, because when you push through that, that's when you get beaten up. When you ignore that, my friend Courtney Nygaard, a psychologist, talked about a nursing home where a woman was beating the crap out of people during personal care. And they couldn't figure it out. They finally paid good money and hired a consultant to come in, spend the day watching this woman's care, and then give them her advice. So she watched her all day, and they all went to the conference room at the end of the day, and they were waiting for this half-hour lecture. And the woman stood up and she said, what I've learned is when she does this, it means stop. And she sat back down. They were ignoring this so many times during the day. They were coming at her with the shower hose, and she was doing this, and they didn't listen and pushed through it, and so she whacked them. Because she was trying to tell them, you're moving too fast, you're not engaging in the process. And they ignored her, and they got beaten up. It was so simple. And yet our focus on tasks and time makes us push through this kinds of distress and actually cause a worse process and actually increase our time demands and our workload as a result. The third E stands for engage. Build relationships. Treat the person like a human being, not just a car that's going through the car wash. Okay? Don't stand there silently and do body work. Share stories. Tell them about yourself. Ask them about them. People say, oh, I don't have time to build relationships. I got too many people to bathe. How long does it take to bathe somebody? What are you doing during those 10 or 20 minutes that you're in the shower room? Are you building relationships, or are you just standing there silently and treating the person like a slab of meat? So this is very important. Slow down, empower, engage. And in so many personal tasks, that is a great way to diffuse anger, to diffuse feelings of loss of autonomy and physical reactivity. The other thing about anger is that it usually means people aren't being heard. One of the biggest complaints I get is people don't take the time to listen to me. So use those active listening skills when people are angry. Start by saying, always start by validating the emotion. I know you probably know all this better than I do, but validation is so key because people with dementia usually are living in a world that's more dominated by emotions and symbolism because they don't inhabit that world of facts and logic and memory so much anymore. So the emotions and the symbols behind what's going on are more important to them. Our problem is we often deal with them from our world instead of getting to where they are. So the first thing you want to do is when you see an emotion being expressed, connect with that emotion. People will not hear your words until you connect with that emotion. Boy, you seem really angry. Tell me what happened. And then close our mouths and listen. It's funny, you talked about 18 seconds last night. You just came up with that number. But there was actually a study of doctors in private practice. And 18 seconds was the average length of time they waited before they interrupted the patient when the patient was reporting their symptoms. So we don't give people a chance to talk, even without dementia. We want to solve the problem. We jump in there. So we have to use active listening skills. And active listening skills, number one, give the person space to talk. It empowers them to express themselves. But also, active listening does two things. Number one, it makes sure that you understand what the person's expressing clearly. Number two, it gives them the powerful message that you took time to understand. And that can do a lot to address their feelings of resentment and anger about what's going on. So once again, another big thing there I threw at you. I could go on all day, but let's stop and see where you're at and what you'd like to hear from me.
What do you see in terms of the role therapists, psychologists can play within assisted living, skilled nursing? Because they're not too prevalent there.
Yeah, I think psychologists have a huge role, actually. I think that they should be used a lot more than they are. And I'll make some strong statements here, and I'm not casting aspersions on anybody. I have some very good friends who are psychiatrists, but most of what we see in skilled care in my part of the world is psychiatric consults more than psychology consults. And psychiatrists, unfortunately, because of our medical system, have been pushed into really being kind of glorified pill jockeys. And, you know, they are great counselors, but they rarely are called down to counsel anymore. They come into a nursing home like ours where over 400 people are living. They have a, you know, he's got a busy Friday and he's got maybe 4 or 5 people he can see in the course of that day, and then he goes away for a month. And so the people that get to the top of the list are the people who we need to know how we should adjust their medications. And because they're the expert in psychotropic medications, that's what he ends up doing all day. They have no time to listen, to counsel, to understand. This is a place where psychologists have a huge role that is so underutilized. And the other thing about people living with dementia is that most of them are very capable of undergoing counseling, of going through cognitive behavioral therapy and other approaches. You don't have to have a totally intact cognitive brain to go through that types of counseling, to process grief, to express your feelings, to get validation, and to help you become empowered, you know, to deal with sometimes solutions that also address those underlying personality disorders that can happen. And, you know, we don't have a pill for personality disorders. And people with dementia sometimes were not nice people before they had dementia. And how do we, you know, staff needs a lot of help with those types of things because they are totally at a loss as to how to approach these things. And sometimes people do need some behavioral approaches. That is a little bit reactive, but sometimes what we're doing actually reinforces a certain way of acting, and we can do things differently to reinforce other ways. Great example, my psychologist friend again was called, there was a kitchen in this traditional nursing home that was off limits to residents, and the staff would congregate there and they would talk in the evening. So he'd come looking for company, he'd walk in, and they would chase him away because he wasn't allowed in there. But what they would do to make him leave was they would bribe him with a cookie. What a perfect stimulus response. What do you think he's going to do the next night? He's heading straight from the kitchen because they have actually reinforced that behavior. So once again, enlightening people about behavioral approaches is another great thing that psychologists can do. So I personally feel, and they're more cost effective than psychiatrists. There are so many reasons to use clinical psychologists, social workers who have counseling degrees, anybody who has this skill. Boy, we need it because 75% of the people living in skilled nursing are living with some form of cognitive disability. And so you have a lot of skills you can bring to bear, and you can also bring this experiential model and approach to help educate the staff about other ways to care besides just calling the doctor for the pill. Thank you. Yeah. I got a couple. Let me jump back here and then I'll go back to you. Yeah. Thanks.
You mentioned an example before of a woman who feels distressed in the evening hours and a person who cares for her because they didn't take her to place. But that there's a certain repetition that's required there because what I kind of take from that is that she may not have the capacity to self-generate kind of self-soothing mechanism, right? Yeah. And so you're proposing this in a way in contrast to that, but I'm not really sure how can a person self-generate any of these?
Yeah.
Don't they still need?
They can always self-generate. But what we need to do is we need to support them in different ways than we are. So our support, in the way I described, is responding to the behavior by taking her somewhere calmer for the moment. But we've responded to the behavior. We didn't understand what caused it in the first place. We superimposed our intervention on the same living environment that doesn't provide these things without working on these. And so and then we do have to respond in the moment, but we can't stop there. We have to go deeper to this thing. So in a case like that, I can't tell you, it was a general thing, whether one of these is more than others. But this woman has probably got a problem in a lot of these areas. So this is very quickly what I do. First of all, I talk in my book about 3 audits. The first one's a medical audit. Is the person got acute medical illness? You always got to think about, do they have a bladder infection? Do they have whatever? And sometimes that's the case, but I think that's a small minority of people that you see. Secondly, are there environmental causes? Too hot, too cold, incontinent, hungry, too much stimulation. Those things, we're good at looking at those things. So usually, the nurses will check for medical illness, they'll check for environmental triggers, and then they'll call the doctor for a pill. But this model says that there's this deeper experiential audit we have to go through, looking at the person's view of the world, looking at the stresses, unmet needs. And in those cases, this is the area where we're not very good. And so that's where we get into these things. Now, what I'm doing with my new book and with my course that I teach is radical and very difficult. I'll give you the 30-second version, but it's much harder than it sounds. What I do is, at the end of toward the end of my 2-day course, I ask somebody in the class to bring in a real-life challenge. And it has to be, because we have limited time, it has to be someone you can tell the story fairly quickly, not spend an hour spinning out their long history. And also, somebody you know pretty well so we can ask you for background information, okay? And so then what I'll do is I'll have the person present the situation, and then I'll give the class 10 minutes for, question and answer, some more background information. What's this person's history? What was their job? What were their family relationships? Whatever. And of course, the class often devolves into, have you tried this? Have you tried that? And what we find is these are good people, and they've tried those things, and they haven't worked. They've tried all those interventions we think of. So then what I do is I say, okay, you've heard about the behavior, you've heard about the person. Now take what that tells you, and we're going to break into 7 groups. I have an identity group, a connectedness group, and we break up into 7 well-being groups. And I say, okay, now you're going to take what you heard about to inform you about how they're doing in each of these domains. But now the hard part is you've got to throw away the behavior and ignore it. Don't fix it, just build your domain of well-being for this person. Come up with a life plan that starts to build their sense of security, their sense of meaning, with what you know or what you need to know about them. And it's very hard because people go back into problem-solving mode. And I remind them the behavior is the cough, this is the pneumonia. And I walk around to the list of things and I go, cough, cough, cough. Nope, you didn't get it, you're trying to fix the behavior. It is so hard to turn our backs on the behavior and find those ramps to well-being. But when you do that, a couple things happen. First of all, I tell people to draw a glass. 7 glasses of identity, connectedness, meaning, whatever. And tell us where that person's glass is right now based on what you know about them. What I find is, even though this is a caring group that has tried everything they can think of, they have 7 glasses that usually, almost always, are less than 25% full. Sometimes almost completely empty. So here's a model of approaching this person's distress. We've done everything we can think of. And here's 7 major areas where that nursing home hasn't even thought that they could be intervening for this person. And then when they look at the list, if they do it right, and if we get a good case that's good for that level of instruction, the person who presented the case is ripping these things off the wall, taking it back to the nursing home, saying, oh my God, there's so much stuff we could be doing for this person we never thought of before. It's a totally different, even the person who's talking about person-centered care, no one is doing it this way. So this is very exciting to me because I'm getting these light bulbs when I talk to people. Anyway, I want to get back to your question as well before we run out of time.
It's okay, I'm good.
Yeah, okay, all right. So that's the quick thing. And like I said, it's much harder than it sounds. It takes 2 days of instruction and a good hour of processing to actually do this with a real case. And sometimes people present the wrong case and it just doesn't work well, and so you have to kind of juggle that a little bit. So that's the newest thing, and that's really what I'm getting to in my book. And so my book my new book spends a lot of time talking about what erodes well-being and how we can enhance it, because then when you identify that there's a deficiency here and here and here, well, how do you increase meaning for somebody who calls out all the time? Well, the book gives you ideas about how we can enhance meaning through personal, through operational, through structural changes in the environment, and then you can start to draw on that learning to build a plan for that person. And once again, it's not a quick fix. She's not going to stop yelling, help me today or tomorrow. But she will eventually, and when she does, it will be durable. It won't be just for the day or for the week. She will actually have what she needed that we never gave her.
Al, thank you so much. We'll
bet.
be working on your stuff.
Thank you. Thank you.